perspectives. And then what we're seeing with ARC and what has really been spearheaded by Cory David Barker is the recognition that we need a systematic structure, a non-denominational structure that affords us an opportunity to think seriously about the linkages between meta models and the broad knowledge-based structure of drawing connections between systems of knowing that have tried to zoom out to higher order areas. And that has not, as from my knowledge, certainly there have been attempts, like, for example, the connection between critical realism and integral represented a particular kind of ARC structure, but never have I, at least that I've been aware of, has there been a systematic attempt to zoom out and to think about the non-denominational connections, meaning we're not going to organize ourselves in a particular perspective, but see the class of perspectives and the class of positions and see how they might be interrelated. So in that context, what we have then with ARC is a systematic emerging structure for a home for people to kind of come together, bring particular perspectives and positions, and afford a kind of synthetic dialogue, a dialogos of sort, an opportunity to build bridges. And I've been super thrilled with the connection that Cory engendered and my connections with other individuals in the ARC space. And so at that level, I'm very happy that we have an opportunity, and this is why I invited Cory to come share his perspective and what he's brought, and so that we can bring folks from the ARC world together and share what it is that we've been up to.
Well, thanks for that introduction. I kind of feel like you should be the one delivering this presentation here, especially considering that I haven't given a public presentation in quite a while. So I'll do my best to deliver a good one. Yeah, my name is Cory David Barker. I'm a cognitive science PhD student from Jyväskylä University. And yeah, the presentation today, let's get it loaded up here, is Foundations of Archdisciplinarity, Advancing Beyond the Meta. And by advancing beyond the meta, we don't mean leaving behind everything that has come before. And how this works, I'll get into as we go forward. So yeah, I'm just going to jump right in, being that a lot of the terminology here is unknown to most people who are in attendance. The first thing that we'll start out with is an introduction to archdisciplinarity, and then we'll talk about arches across the meta, and then we'll end with archdisciplinarity in terms of study and practice. So, introduction to archdisciplinarity. So we're introducing three terms, and these terms are intended to be neutral, non-denominational terms, so that as people are coming together in this meta space, coming from different perspectives with different frameworks, we have some neutral language that we can use, that we can share in common to communicate about what we're doing. So archdisciplinarity is here defined as the scope of scholarly inquiry that treats big picture theory of everything, unification, meta-theoretical frameworks as units of analysis. Arch theory is a scale of theory that builds on and synthesizes across big picture frameworks. And then arch modernism, a stage of social evolution that is generated by people coming together towards unifying across unification frameworks. Archdisciplinarity is not an ideology. It is a scope of inquiry. So how we get to archdisciplinarity is through this these progressive steps or stages or levels of social evolution of human understanding, which starts with disciplinarity, which is centralized within a specific domain. And no discipline exists as an island. So in terms of the disciplinarity here in the diagram, we could probably put like dotted lines where one node represents a discipline, and then it connects with other disciplines and draws from them in that way. But with interdisciplinarity, we have inquiry between two or more disciplinary scopes. And in interdisciplinarity, people they don't necessarily favor one or the other. They take both disciplines and then they combine them in the inquiry. The transdisciplinarity occurs when the inquiry expands to the point where it starts to include all disciplines and interdisciplinary scopes. And then this is where we get these sort of big picture frameworks where people are trying to fit together everything everyone understands about everything. And so archdisciplinarity is just a natural progression. It's an inquiry across these transdisciplinary scopes. So arch theory as a scale of theory, whereas archdisciplinarity isn't an ideology, it's not a paradigm, it's just a scope of inquiry. Arch theories can be ideological. They're theories about what could be true. So again, we have this progression where we start with theories of proposition of what is true with supporting evidence. But then we have meta theories, and I have a couple definitions here, and I'm sure many people in the audience would say that there are other definitions we could add, and that can be true. But for just the scope of what we're talking about here, I'll just say that meta theory is generally a scale of theory that is either self-referential or it builds on one or more other theories. But then we have unification meta theories. These are the theories that synthesize across any and all theories into a coherent architectural, processual, or calculatory unification framework. So I know this kind of gets a little bit word salad here, but all these words have very distinct meanings, and we'll come back to this a little bit later in this presentation. And so if we go back to the slide here, and we're talking about transdisciplinary inquiry, the kinds of frameworks that it generates are meta-theoretical and unification meta-theoretical frameworks. So an arch theory is a theory that synthesizes across these unification meta-theories and their components along what we term arches. And again, I'm sorry, just in terms of being organized about the presentation, we'll come back to arches a little bit later. And so we also have this other term we're introducing called arch modernism as a stage of social evolution. And so again, there's a lot of different ways that people make sense of this general social evolution, and people give different definitions. And I think all the differing representations that people have are all important, and that we should then include them here. But I'm just going to outline some general consensus that people usually have about these different eras or cultural evolutionary steps that societies go through, which is pre-modernism, which is primarily based on religious notions, modernism, which is based on scientific notions, but then postmodernism, which is based on the notion that all truth and knowledge are relative and situational. So people follow a certain method of how to know things, and then they end up with a certain schema of making sense of a particular domain or the world. And then other people follow a different methodology, and then they come to different kinds of conclusions. And then there's no way to reconcile these different frameworks. So with metamodernism, it's based on the recognition that first of all, the previous sensibilities all have positive and negative traits, and that we can carry forward the best of what has come before us. But also it comes with the notion that these different methods of how to know things can actually be fit together into a coherent framework, that they actually just represent different ways that people can be, different ways that people can know, and that they all belong to the same overall scope of what is possible for humans to know and do. So archmodernism is newly emerging, and even though I write here, there's a sensibility about unifying across meta-modern worldviews, overcoming their limitations and building on their strengths towards finding new ways to make the world a better place, we really actually don't know what archmodernism is going to be like, because it's emerging now. It's happening now, and it's hard for us to really reflect on ourselves and have more specifics about what this is going to be. We don't have a lot of examples of what people have done. And so that's, I think, a good enough sort of start in terms of understanding about arch modernism. So arches across the meta. So what are arches? So the etymology of arches is about the structure of supported by extremities, chief and principal, and then roguish and mischievous. So when we think about an arc, we have this sort of shape. And if you think about like in a doorway or in a bridge, you have all these different supporting structures that you need in order to be able to produce that shape. So in terms of arch as a definition, arches are archetypal universal patterns that hold across all these different unification meta-theories. And we put forth that they are candidates for universal laws. When we talk about like the notion of like roguish and mischievous, we might make association to like the trickster motif, where you have extremities of things and then you look at one particular way of making sense of the world through one lens, but then other people come along and then they have a sense making that kind of contradicts it, but it also makes sense at the same time. And so the notion of having arches is sort of like being able to navigate in this space. And our archetypes, the reason I have archetype here is because in terms of defining arches, the original idea was to call them archetypes, but archetypes have a strong association with Jung's framework. And I mean, I've read mostly everything that Jung has written, and I think that he has a lot of things that he said that are true, and there's a lot of things that we've updated our understanding over time. But we wanted to find a more neutral term that didn't have a direct association specifically with one particular person in their framework. So we went with arch. But the same notion is true with archetype, in that they are these universal forms that can take on different expressions. And the more variations of meta-theoretical and unification meta-theoretical frameworks that we overlap, the better understanding that we're going to get about what these archetypal universal patterns are. So arches across the meta. Let me take a look at the time here. Okay, so arches across the meta. So here I'll give some examples of what arches are. So universal calculability and computability. So early 1900s, Kurt Gödel proposed the completeness and incompleteness theorems, which basically says that if you have a axiomatic system to describe mathematics, you need to have another axiomatic system in order to explain those axioms. And I don't have it written in here, but there was a guy by the name of Alfred Tarski who came along, and then he demonstrated that this actually holds for all formalized languages. And what this means is that if you have a belief system, or you have some sort of a schema for making sense of the world, in order to prove it, you need to have a greater scope that can explain it. And then when you explain that greater scope, you need to have an even greater scope in order to explain that. And then this created what I would say is probably really the beginning of the post-modernity era in the 1900s. And we ended up getting, and I have some notes here I wrote in. So when we're talking about different kinds of languages, we're talking about like meta-mathematics with meta-set theory, meta-logic, meta-linguistics, meta-semantics, where people would come up with a theory about their theory, or some sort of description about their descriptionary language. And what Turing showed is that in his system of logic based on ordinals, which was his PhD dissertation, is he showed that if you have enough of a stack of complexity of axioms explaining axioms, eventually you arrive at axioms that can explain all of the previous axioms. And this actually led to him and Alonzo Church was his PhD supervisor, and they came up with the Church-Turing thesis, and then this eventually carried over into Church's lambda calculus. And so this is the reason why I'm taking a moment to explain this all, is because in in lambda calculus, basically what Church did is he showed that across all these different languages and meta languages, you have types, operations that operate between the types, and then you have an overall function. And then that function becomes a new unit, it becomes a new type that has a relationship through operations with other units that together create a new function. And then this creates a repeating universal pattern that holds across all the levels. So whereas people were saying, oh, well, you can never have a universal truth because there's always a greater scope of understanding, it turns out that there are repeating patterns of universal properties that hold no matter how many times you go up the stack. So, of course, this led to the development of the integrated circuit, and then lambda calculus was the basis, the logic mathematical basis for formalizing modern computer languages. And then it created the revolution of the digital era because people understood this arch and they were able to implement it into computers. Wolfram has this computational universe, which follows similarly from Turing and Church and others. And then I cited myself here with the universal prototype, which I'm not going to get into because I'm already running up on my time here. So another arch is complexity and fractals. So when you have units that have relationships and you have relationships between the relationships and it forms a system, and then that system becomes a new unit and the process repeats, then we get things like cybernetics, we get notions of holons, we get notions of fractals. The reason I have comments here with hierarchical complexity and transitions is because Commons described the combinatoric process in which units go through as they evolve in their complexity. We have Capra with systems theory, Surma with Mariology, and then Wilbur, of course, carries forward holons. And then Ross made a fantastic contribution, which was showing that these processes that Commons was talking about in transition dynamics are actually fractal. And so every time a person goes up a cognitive level of complexity, it's repeating the same fractal transition dynamics, producing each level. So we also have arches across the meta in terms of integrative levels, because when you are having increases in complexity, you're having a subvene and a supervene around a complex system, you get different levels. And then this was something that Vervaeke was talking about earlier in terms of leveling up. He was talking about levels as being this universal thing. And this goes back to Needham, who coined the term in 1937. I have a list here of different individuals who made contributions to the notion of integrative levels. Feivelman brought together everyone that came before him and created a formal theory of integrative levels. Of course, Wilbur had his great chain of being. Kleinberg took all of the different integrative level expressions that he could find in the literature. There's like over 100, and he brought them all together. I have these in my references, and there's references at the end, so I'll post this on the website and people can take a look if they want to learn more about that. But before, when I was talking about universal calculability, and we were talking about universal types and universal operations, well, these also take expression in arches of universal architectures and universal processes, which is what exists in terms of entities and ontology, and how things behave in terms of action and methodology. So when people construct different integrative level frameworks, they take expression through being either architectural or processual or some sort of calculability between the two. And the more specificity that people have, along with the more clarity that they have about the universal classes that populate them, the better people get at being able to calculate what the architectures are and how they transform and change over time and produce more complexity. And I have a bunch of references here, and I just don't have time to go through all of them. But I just want to highlight that in terms of universal processes, people talk about domain-specific development in in terms of like Holberg with moral stages, and Erikson with psychosocial stages, and Kruger with the ego stages. But then there are also frameworks that are human domain general, where people attempt to describe universal patterns that hold across domains of human development. And then finally, we have nature in general. And so I have a list here of different examples of how people try and describe universal processes in the big scale that goes beyond just people. Other arches across the meta: objectivity, subjectivity, and transjectivity. So kind of curious, mutual discovery. I started using the term transjectivity back 2017, 2018. I made a video about it in 2019. Vervaeke uses the same term, and we came to the same conclusion in terms of how to use the word. My derivative came from Niculescu. He had the notion of the included middle, where he described the objectivity and subjectivity, and then that space between that allows them to converge and overlap. And then, of course, Gregg Henriques, the I-quad coin, describing the relationship between objectivity and subjectivity. Yeah, there it is. Universal grammar is another arch that we see that holds across a multiplicity of these unification meta-theoretical frameworks. I believe it started with Tarski in terms of meta-language. We see it in Chomsky with meta-linguistics and universal grammar. Espard Hargens and Alderman and Pascal have frameworks that attempt to describe universal grammar. If I go back here and we take a look at universal architectures and processes, what are these but nouns and verbs? And so Espard and Hargens, and then also Alderman and Pascal Alderman and Pascal with integral grammatology is basically, they're saying, oh, well, nouns and verbs are just two, and we can actually do this with other units of grammar as fundamental units of expression that hold across human representation. And then finally, the last one is Rouliad and singularity. Wolfram has a new kind of science. Also on his website, he talks about multi-computation, which is, if we do a conversion with unification meta-theoretical models, you have these frameworks that are calculating everything. They're finding a way to describe transformations of things over time, how things become more complex. They have different kinds of rules for how they do it. Multi-computation means being able to hold them all simultaneously and do the calculations simultaneously. Kurzweil, Korotayev, they have described singularity trajectories of how evolution and complexity are going towards an apex point. I describe Dishik processes. Dishik has an association with God. I mean, actually, in terms of like singularity systems and how they operate as a certain kind of a process, being able to operate on them, being able to locate pressure points in which, if operated on, have the greatest impact of effect on the singularity system. Of course, Gregg Henriques has his fifth joint point, elephant sun god, as a symbolic representation of this. And then Freinacht wrote a blog post about Feigenbaum's constant, which is curious because in order for it to make sense, you have to look backwards in time as there's a drawing forward and a shortening of time in a fractal manner of the emergence of memes and meta memes moving towards a certain point. Yeah, I guess I'll just keep moving on here. Archdisciplinarity in terms of study and practice. So archdisciplinary study, what constitutes a unification meta theory? Just in summary, it has to have some sort of a schema that organizes in a coherent manner, architectures, processes, or some sort of calculatory, functional, recursively formulaic framework. And then also it can consist of stratification or plexification, consisting of integrative levels and or complexity, and universal classes that populate them. And then in terms of doing comparative research, It can be starting out with something easy, like looking across history, location, authorship, cultural, institutional, and social contexts. It can get into more intermediate territory when we take an arch and then that we already have established, and we can look across other models that haven't been looked at through that lens. And then it gets more advanced when we want to do full one-to-one comparative analyses between two big picture frameworks, looking for what is same, similar, different, and opposite, towards synthesis, towards discovery and validation of arches. And in terms of archdisciplinary practice, archdisciplinarity doesn't replace metamodernity. It doesn't replace transdisciplinarity. These are the building blocks in which we do the comparative analysis. Different kinds of frameworks have different answers to different kinds of questions. They have different kinds of explanatory power. And one example I like to give is like Gregg Henriques with his unification of psychology. Like if you go back historically, you had all these different kinds of psychology, and then it took someone coming around, bringing them all together. Doesn't mean that any individual kind of psychology is wrong. It just means that they have a specific kind of methodology that answers specific kinds of questions. When you bring them all together, you can sort of sort out some of the errors they had, carry them all forward together. And so it's similar with archdisciplinarity. We can carry forward these unification meta-theoretical frameworks for the explanatory power that they have. Arch-theoretical integrative pluralism means working across meta-ontological, meta-methodological, and meta-epistemological pluralities. We might not always know how to fit them together. We might not always be clear about what the arches are in our common ground, but we can use them at least jointly. We can, what's the word I'm looking for? Well, I can't think of it, but basically I'm just getting at, well, I'll skip it for now. It'll probably come back to me. Comparative analysis means establishing common ground and commonalities among approaches. It can be done, and alliances can be made without making ideological commitments, and that's actually what my thought was. I think sometimes people don't want to work with other people who have different kinds of unification meta-theoretical frameworks because they're concerned that they might be associated with that particular ideology. I think that we can have enough understanding with each other and enough clarity that even if we don't agree with other people entirely, we can still make alliances with different individuals and different communities for what common ground we can find. And lastly, on critical analysis, in terms of ARC, we sort of position this as secondarily after comparative analysis, because if you wanna talk about the errors that exist in other people's models with them, and you want to actually see change for the better, you need to establish mutuality and trust. And if that doesn't exist, then people aren't going to listen. They're just going to think that they're being accosted. So yeah, we place most of our emphasis on comparative analysis in ARC. So I'm out of time here, but yeah, there are existent arch theories here. Turing was one of them. Esbjørn Hagens with complex integral realism, where he synthesizes Morin, Wilbur, and Baskar's big picture frameworks. Hedlund also integrating integral theory and Baskar's critical realism. And then Dempsey with emergentism, synthesizing unified theory of reality and the unified theory of knowledge. So yeah, Archdisciplinary Research Center's mission is basically just to provide fellowship and academic and independent scholars a space to come together for consilience. It's in facilitating cooperation among meta-theoretical communities, supporting novel, upcoming new frameworks, comparison between frameworks that exist, and applied research, applying these to real-world problems from both the local to global level. And then also offering education opportunities and consulting services. We do have an Introduction to Archdisciplinary course coming up. We're having, what, like 12, 15 presenters across 3 months, and 2-hour 2-hour sessions. So not only do we just have a presentation, but we provide a lot of time for people to have conversation, bring in what their interests are, what they're learning about, or what they're interested in can relate to their own life and their own work and things that they want to do, connecting them directly with people who both create and advocate for these big picture frameworks. And then we do this across these different divisions I have listed here. So I have 2 pages of references. Thanks for watching. Visit our website, arc.voyage. You'll find a link to our Facebook community. And that's it. That's my presentation. I'm sure I missed a lot and probably stumbled over some things, but I think I did well for not presenting for a couple of years. So,
Cory, that was fantastic. Yeah, if you can. So thank you so much for that, because what it affords, as I sort of stumbled into in my intro, what you laid out is the systematized, non-denominational way of potentially framing bridging, arcing structures in a way that I think is powerful and novel. And I commend you for that. And that's why I certainly wanted to take this opportunity. I think it's crucial, sort of the enterprise of consilience. And it's crucial to point to the capacity of an emerging capacity of constructive dialogue between systems. As a historian of psychology, I can tell you that although there was a lot of muted voices that said, hey, maybe we can bridge between, say, psychoanalysis and behaviorism, there absolutely was not any systematic structure for that. It wasn't really until the 1980s I became president of the Society for the Exploration of Psychotherapy Integration that even that system sort of brought together within that minor context of psychotherapy relative to this context. So to have a system that is actually architecturally structured to build these arcs between meta theories is a really beautiful thing. And I think you did an excellent job of laying out its key components, showing that there's a lot of weeds and a lot of depth here, but at the same time, you didn't drown us in it. So thank you very much for that, friend. Deeply.
Yeah, I just want to say one more thing. That's kind of like the whole point of having this organization is to create a neutral place. Because, we want to advocate for everyone's communities. We want to see each of these communities be as successful as possible. However, when people go into a particular community, in a way, it serves certain demographics. So certain people are going to be more attracted to a certain community and a certain framework for a certain reason. And it's important that that exists for that purpose. People have a pathway in. They have a framework that they can identify with that fits to their sense making. But we also need to have a place that's neutral. So you can go there where you kind of have a foot in a lot of different places, and you don't necessarily want to be getting pushed one way or the other. But there's a lot of different situations and a lot of different reasons why people might be interested in ARC. So yeah, so I suppose like going forward here, we'll make a round and everyone can kind of talk about what they're doing in this space here. Everyone here are committee members of ARC. Gregg and Daniel, along with myself, are directors. And yeah, so I suppose we'll start with Gregg, if you want to go ahead and talk about what you've been doing.
Yeah, I'll be brief because I think people are kind of getting a sense of my version of ARC for the day. So I'll just sort of let the day speak for itself. But let me say that the sentimentality that this conference represents is and why we have this invited address is enormously overlapping with the general frame. And although sort of it's a UTalk conference at one level, it's UTalk sponsored to afford us to reflect on consilience, each of us bringing our own particular positions and hoping to achieve a multi-perspectival, coherent, integrated pluralism. And so that's what I feel is kind of the sensibility of this. I feel like sort of we've laid that out. And so I really feel like this is sort of all of us sort of coming together and living in that space. So I'll pass it on to somebody else, leaving it there, given the time. Why don't I pass it over to Daniel as a part of this founding this enterprise?
Yeah, well, it's just wonderful to hear your presentation, Cory, and just looking at I understand. I just want to empathize with we have 100 people listening in or something like that. Yeah, that of course, if you're not familiar with the topics we're talking about here, it sounds well hopelessly abstract, and you know, what you're getting is a zoomed out version of complex things, and this place, the ARC, is here to provide good and fair rules of the game, so that we can people who have worked on theories of everything, we're still finding new such people, and people who may have put in decades worth of work. They usually find very small audiences for this particular reason, that theories of everything, they come from a depth of knowledge of one particular discipline, and then eventually you sort of break the boundaries of your own discipline. You start to see a bigger picture of reality, but from deep within the discipline. It can be physics, it can be computation, it can be psychology, it can be sociology or social science, as in my own case. You sort of break out of it and you start to see a bigger world, you start to see patterns, and you start to notice patterns that seem to have bearing across disciplines, but you're going to speak your own language still. So to download somebody's particular theory of everything, somebody's meta theory, takes a lot of work and takes a lot of effort, and all of us who have created or worked on stuff that is in the direction of meta theory, we feel sort of very enticed by the promise of finding something great, and at the same time we feel frustrated by carrying a load of having something to say to the world and so forth, and there being a huge barrier of communication. So while also commending you, Gregg, for creating this whole day then, and this whole conference that allows UTalk to get its fair share of engagement. It's a huge step forward, not just for you, but for all of us. So just saying that the ARC, something that wasn't mentioned, I think, Cory, in your presentation, is that we have a sort of social contract, that we call it, certain rules of the game that have to do with when we enter into this space, we're actually less concerned with defending our own theory and rather improving upon it by letting others help us improve upon it, right? So that we're sort of offering our own children, like an archetypal good mother. She has to eventually let go of her child and give her to a world, like so that the child can come and be a savior in the world or something. And it's sort of like that. This is sort of the nursery for little meta theory Jesus children, right? From whatever disciplines. You're laughing, Gregg. I wasn't joking. Yeah. Yeah. I just want to give people the idea there that we're trying to reverse the trend of when it gets complex and when it gets really abstract and when there's a lot of prestige in it and a lot of love in the projects, we get competitive, and we're trying to go past that. We're trying with a whole framework to create another culture that is truly archdisciplinary, that truly honors the differences, and has skillful means of handling. I mean, just not necessarily just saving face in the face of conflict of ideas, but sort of going past them, just focusing on the arcs, and then we all work on our little theory over here, right? And eventually we find a language to talk about what binds the best theories in the world together. Like, so we have all the best theories about all the best theories, and this is the club for all the best theories about all the best theories. So we're gonna have to behave if we're gonna make this work. And yeah, that's one of the major thrusts we're making here. In terms of introduction, I'm Daniel Görtz. I'm an author and a sociologist from Sweden, and I'm most known for my work in the topic of metamodernism. I pass it to is this Andrew Robinson also part of the panel? Is that correct? Or
He's
what?
helping with the text.
Okay, yes. I'm sorry, Andrew. Brendan.
Hi. Yeah. So I'll talk about what I do or will be doing as part of ARC in terms of like a logistical community facilitator role after. But in terms of my own personal interest and contribution, I mean, I have a background in religious studies, deeply interested in issues of meaning, purpose, that sort of a thing. And so my studies have been, as they've expanded, have come to include things like information theory and entropy, and brought me in a lot of interesting ways in relationship to levels of being, as it's been coming up. And I'll be touching on some of this in my presentation on my stuff in a little bit. But I don't think it's an accident that there has historically been a sort of interest in meta theoretical frameworks from people who are also interested in mysticism, spirituality, religion. I think that there's a common thread in the sense that people are interested in ultimate reality, and there are various definitions of religion that refer to, whether it's ultimate concern or the totality of things, and different people have framed that in different terms. But I think that there's a desire to kind of try to engage the ultimate framework as best we can, and recognize that that's also part of a learning process that's dynamically unfolding. So my personal interest is sort of the intersection between meta theory and archdisciplinarity and religious sense making, I guess you could say, and meaning more broadly, as I'll be talking about in a little bit. In terms of the actual kind of specific things that I'll be doing for now, they're kind of including the Facebook group, kind of contributing to the moderation of that, as well as hopefully doing some interviews and discussions on the YouTube channel and that sort of a thing. So trying to continue the dialogue and the discussion, and kind of getting these ideas out there, and then facilitating some of the synthesis conversations that we hope to see happen is some of the stuff that I'll be doing. And also, as Cory mentioned in the presentation, my emergentism book is a specific archdisciplinary sort of synthesis that includes the work of Bobby Azarian, Gregg Henriques, and as I'm continuing to do work, I'm writing a book right now called The Evolution of Meaning, that's also taking in the ideas of John Vervaeke and a lot of others as well. So trying to synthesize across these different arches is sort of my work, and again, through a particular kind of religious register. I'll throw it over to Bruce.
Great, thank you, Brendan. And Cory, I really enjoyed your presentation. I think it was a great overview. And I've personally been interested in meta theory for quite a long time. I've been looking at it from both kind of like a meta theology point of view for many years, looking at how different religious traditions intersect and different philosophical traditions intersect. And I've been interested in integral philosophy for many years. And my own project, which I'm bringing here and bringing into this nursery, Cory talked about a comparative approach rather than a critical approach to each other's meta theories. And, I really appreciate the comparative approach. And I also like Layman Pascal's distinction about the imperative method, which is not only that we're comparing across boundaries, but allowing ourselves, in a sense, to be penetrated by the other, to be informed by the other. And so it's a space in which not only we offer what we have, but we allow ourselves to open in a way to being informed by the insights and the encounter with other people. And I think that's been behind my own interest in the kind of the meta theology also, is how can people from different spiritual and philosophical orientations interact in a way that both honors the particularity of whatever place they come from, but is open to otherness and allows for a mutual informing across topological boundaries. So one of the things that I'm doing in my own meta theory work, as Cory mentioned, is around the integral grammatology And Daniel mentioned sometimes you start within a field, and then as you dig into it, you begin to see patterns, and then it takes you into another space. And of course, I was already involved with integral theory, and so that's a big part of the integral project. But as I was looking more and more deeply at philosophy and going into different deep channels of multiple philosophical approaches, I could see that there were both strong commonalities in terms of worldview scope and very fundamental ontological commitments and epistemological commitments that differentiated them that weren't really fully or well explained by the categories within integral theory. So I started looking at what those were, and for me, what surfaced were basic fundamental commitments that could be correlated to the parts of speech, whether they're process and verbal oriented, or perspectival and pronounal oriented, or nounal and substance oriented, or prepositional and relational oriented. And so I began to look at all the traditions that I could find and see if I could identify different fundamental ontological commitments. And I found that, it seemed to hold up pretty well, that there were these deep commitments, but no tradition that I found was exclusively one or the other, just like no language functions with nouns alone or verbs alone. Instead, they give a different kind of organization to them with the privileging of some modes. There are some modes like, Blackfoot language is very verbal, and it elevates the verbal, and nouns and other parts are subordinate to that. English is more noun focused, right? So different philosophies and theologies also function in that way. So I have an idea called ontochoreography, and another one called henontology, and I'll be giving a class on all this stuff in the workshop that Cory mentioned. But basic ideas are learning to identify what some of the core elements are that are operative in a worldview or in a philosophical system, and in yourself beginning to practice circulating through different ontological centers to see what changes within your own worldview. If you switch from a relational view, from a nounal view, or a process view, what happens within your own ontology and epistemology? And so there's a practice of circulation, and there's a practice of taking on the different commitments of different orientations. Henontology relates to henotheology, and really it's the formal word would be kathano ontology. It's basically like in India, where the one, there's a religious commitment to some deity as the one, but there are all the other deities that are recognized. But within the overall religion, different people might be committing to different deities as the one that represents everything else. And so there's a kind of floating oneness. So it's an integrative pluralism, where you can take different centers and then watch what unfolds from taking that stance. So that's a big part of what I try to explore through meta-theoretical lenses. And I'm definitely trying to explore what I'm doing in relationship to everyone else's meta-theoretical projects here. And then one thing that I'm wanting to do with, Arch is, or ARC is something similar to what Gregg is doing here with the Consilience Conference. And that's one reason we haven't done anything yet. We're planning out a kind of symposium of bringing people from different communities into dialogue together, not only about meta theory, but about the ultimate deeper world impacting projects that the different communities are involved in, that tend to be centered around different philosophical and meta-theoretical commitments. How can we bring them into dialogue in different ways? So that's a project that's going to be unfolding later this year. So I think that's a summary of what I'm doing. So thank you. And I'll hand it over to Layman.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Layman Pascal. A couple of bits of housekeeping. Tom and Mark from Parallax will kill me if I don't throw my course into the chat. So there's a link there. It's through April on collaborative practices and theory related to how masculine and feminine contribute to the evocation of the sacred in a metamodern sense. I also noticed that Cory talked about Wilber's reference to the great chain of being, and I just wanted to tweak that a little bit because Wilber specifies a distinction between his model, which is a great nest relative to the great chain. Also, I had a fantastic conversation with James Schofield yesterday, and he might be a really good fit for this project. Beyond that, I'd say a few personal words about how I relate to all of this. When I was in high school, I worked with this interesting network of people on what we call an information theory, which was, just an attempt to use general phenomenological patterns of information processing to unfold all possible models. Later, I got into the integral language, which is very provocative, and my feeling was I needed to understand Ken Wilber's work and the integral theory and its offshoots by being able to regenerate it in my own version in a manner that accounts for all the critiques and holes that I experienced and unfolds the insights I found from other domains. And to me, something about that attitude describes a certain kind of person and a certain kind of cultural emergence. So I'm really interested in the whole playground of people who are making approaches like that, who feel the necessity in themselves to try to bring these models together and to create a culture, to create a theoretical or theological even framework for this, and the relevance of this community of people to the kind of world we're facing, which is so information loaded and so complex and so fragmented that only really sophisticated integrative model makers are going to have a chance to be able to tell us something useful about this world. So I love the audacity of this, and it's not an unjustified audacity like Cory was saying. It's not an assertion of our models over everyone's models, but it's a spirit about using scale invariant principles and recurrent emergences and general phenomenological encounters that occur in all models and in all meta models. So there's a justified audacity whose possible futures are necessary, I think, if we're going to build a planetary wisdom civilization, without which we're probably doomed. For myself, where I'm at, my primary focus is on spiritual practice and a model of spiritual practice that I think supports the emergence of integrative meta-modern, arch-modern culture. Next to that, I'm playing some role between and for community, which goes to ARC's consortium project, which Bruce was just mentioning, and also goes to what I think ARC is doing, which is the need to set up supports and incentives so that people like me and other people that I would like to encourage are able and willing and held to be able to put more energy into the theory building and the culture work and the inner practice necessary for a healthy arch modernity. So I might ramble here into some of the elements of my own theory that I'm focusing on, but really I don't think there's a lot of time left, so I'm going to pass it on from here to Scout.
Thanks, Layman. Excuse me. Hi, I'm Scout. And first of all, really good to see all of your faces and to hear all of the wonderful things that everyone's working on and how everything sort of converges, both in seen and unseen ways. As for myself, I am an independent researcher. I'm a musician, I'm a writer, I'm a ritual art practitioner, and the work that I do sits somewhere between somatic inquiry, cultural analysis, creative expression, and a phanopoetic systems change. So the way that systems move towards vitality in unseen ways. My belief is that art changes the world in phanopoetic ways. And so my work is to really encourage people to evoke and observe irrational phenomena through emergent storytelling, folk psychological analysis, and artistic play. The sort of nickname that I have for this is systems experiencing, which is meant to be a collaborator and mirror of systems thinking. Let's see what else. How this bridges in with archdisciplinarity is that if the patterns that we are looking at are truly universal patterns, they can be experienced and recognized in our daily lives within the mundane. And so I'm primarily interested in having people directly experience and understand how these universal patterns show up in their own lives. I'm working on a lot of projects right now. I wrote down a couple of different things that are somewhat relevant to ARC, but also relevant to the presentation that I will be doing in the Metamodern Spirituality Symposia, which is coming up in a couple of minutes. So I'm working on a project, which most of the projects are under the title, The Oscillator's Stone. So this includes the email newsletter where I write about metamodern cultural sensibility and esoteric spirituality, the convergences between those two things. Next week, I'm starting a ritual art practice course called Weirdcraft, which I will be leading. It's a 6-month container where people will explore the esoteric arts through the lens of the metamodern cultural sensibility. Starting next month, I'll be leading a monthly practice called metamythology. I define metamythology in this context as the public interpretation of one's own myths, coupled with the collaborative reinterpretation of those same myths. Another piece that I'm working on is a ritual performance art project entitled May the Goddess Smile Upon You. And it is based on the Shinto-inspired religious iconography of the popular Legend of Zelda video game franchise. And I'll be exploring this through a Japanese form of performative movement meditation called Buto. It'll be guided by the inquiries what constitutes a place and what happens when a fictional goddess becomes real. So those are most of the things that I'm currently working on. They all sort of converge at the level of trying to foster a culture that is friendlier and more receptive to the ineffable and mundane aspects of human spiritual life. Thank you.
And we're just about out of time, so we'll go Johan and then Bobby. 30 seconds, go.
Oh, yeah. From Lund, Sweden, working primarily with meta theory, applied on meta theory. And things that are really interesting for me is how to tie in meta theory into how we use language and cognition. And things like we often see meta theories or like state theories that this is the highest stage and so on. How can you flip that thing around and show that the highest is actually the lowest if you position it in other ways? So there are a lot of things that can be done in this space to make a lot of these concepts acceptable, because it's not acceptable to people if something is the highest, so to say, without showing how it's also is the lowest. Yeah, shortly that. Bobby.
Yeah, great presentation, Cory. Yeah, so 30 seconds, I'll try to just summarize, I guess, what I'm interested in, how it's related to ARC. So when science talked about theories of everything, traditionally we're talking about reductionist physics theories that basically just saw the universe as this system made of particles, and then these particles follow these deterministic trajectories. So if that's the only story, then it basically says that life and consciousness and culture are epiphenomena, and they're transient, and they're kind of this quirky offshoot of this larger cosmic process that is pretty much random and meaningless. So it's really nice to see people coming together talking about theories of everything that actually include emergent phenomenon like life, mind, and culture, because I think any true theory of everything has to include all of those things. Those are the things that are most interesting to us. But I also think that the story of the universe and the story of cosmic evolution is the story of these emergences, and that the universe isn't this arbitrary system. It's organizing itself into these complex adaptive systems that acquire knowledge about the world around it. And through that process, you have physical systems that start to be able to experience the universe. So if these physical systems are part of the universe, you can see this process as the universe waking up and starting to experience itself through life. So if you have a theory of everything that recognizes these levels in the structure of reality, then you can start to have new types of predictive models where you can start to say, you can see the commonalities between organisms and societies, for example, and you can start to understand how societies evolve and adapt and can be best optimized based on principles of how organisms evolve, and vice versa. So basically you have these new tools for explanation and prediction by using the levels to compare systems that normally were kept separate in their different disciplines. So arch theories basically unify things, but they also say that with these emergences, you'll have novel properties at each level. So it's fine to study them independently. But if you don't also see the coherence between these models, then you're missing out on the big picture, which I think involves life, and that life is a part of the complexity increase process. So it's
sorry,
a new
sorry to cut you off.
Yeah, let me.
Sorry to
Yeah,
cut you off, but we do have to go because I have to moderate the next session, which started
sure.
a minute ago.
Yeah, just one sentence. So
Sorry
the new
about
story
that.
is
Yeah.
one of levels, and so that's what I write about in the Road to Omega Substack, and you can follow me there. My book is The Romance of Reality, and I'll be talking tomorrow. There you go, Cory.